Say that call sign again, and this court ceases to exist. That's what the Admiral warned her. But Devon Hale didn't come to be silent. She came to end careers. So she stood, looked the judge dead in the eye, and whispered two forbidden words, "Iron Echo." The room exploded, phones seized, a judge vanished, and a hidden war, long buried beneath classified lies, began to surface. Because she wasn't just exposing a cover-up, she was the last living member of a unit the Pentagon swore never existed. And now she's hunting the ones who sent them to die. This is Veteranbiker. Comment 1 if you're new, 2 if you've been with us, 3 if you ride with us every week. Like, subscribe, and stay to the end. The air within Courtroom 3 of Fort Brighton Naval Base was an unsettling blend of sterile calm and palpable oppression. Sunlight filtered through narrow, high windows cast long anemic stripes across the polished mahogany of the gallery benches and the gleaming brass fixtures. This wasn't a place of warmth or justice, it was a theater of military discipline, designed to intimidate and to impose a rigid, unyielding order. Every surface seemed to have been scrubbed to a clinical shine. Every sound, the rustle of a paper, the subtle shift in a seat, seemed to echo with a disproportionate finality. At the center of this cold tableau sat Lieutenant Commander Devon Hale. She occupied the defendant's chair with a posture that was less of a stance and more of an endurance. Her dress blues, immaculate and pressed to razor-sharp perfection, were a stark visual contrast to the human weight she carried. Across her chest, a constellation of ribbons and medals spoke of 2 decades of exemplary service, of courage under fire, of leadership that had, for years, been beyond reproach. But under the harsh fluorescent lights they felt like anchors, dragging her down, a heavy irony in a room where her honor was being systematically dismantled. Her face, a study in quiet stoicism, betrayed nothing of the storm raging beneath the surface. Her gaze was steady, her expression unreadable, a blank canvas of professional detachment that was perhaps the only defense she had left. Facing her, from his elevated perch on the bench, was Judge Advocate Ethan Drakey. His uniform was impeccable, his salt and pepper hair neatly combed, but his eyes held a cold fire. They were not the eyes of a neutral arbiter, but of a man who had already passed judgment. When he spoke, his voice was a low, gravelly drone, dripping with a condescension that was impossible to mistake. "You're not exceptional, Commander. You're just weak," he declared, his words hanging in the tense silence. It was a verbal blow, delivered with the practiced cruelty of someone who had long since forgotten the humanity behind the uniform. The gallery, filled with officers whose careers had been built on deference and decorum, shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Their silence was a shared verdict, a consensus of barely veiled judgment that pressed in on Devon from all sides. In the back row, a single figure sat apart from the rest. Lieutenant Vivian Kershaw, a young intelligence officer, was dressed in civilian clothes that were a deliberate, if subtle, break from the sea of uniforms. Her dark hair was pulled back in a neat bun, her expression one of intense focus as she took detailed notes in a leather-bound notebook. Unbeknownst to the judge, the prosecutor, or anyone else in the room, the microphone in her handbag was discreetly recording every word, every nuance, every scathing remark. Her presence was a small, almost invisible anomaly in the carefully controlled environment, a flicker of something unknown that went unnoticed by everyone except, perhaps, the woman at the defendant's table. The prosecution's case was a clinical, methodical assault on Devon's record. Colonel Augustine Hargrove, a prosecutor whose career had been built behind desks rather than in combat zones, stood at the center of the courtroom. He was a man who understood the language of procedure and protocols far better than the language of war. The evidence he presented played across a series of screens mounted throughout the chamber. grainy satellite footage of a compound in a classified location, thermal signatures moving through the buildings, and a sterile, clipped narration of the mission's comms chatter. This was Operation Tideglass, a covert extraction mission that had, in the prosecution's narrative, been a flawless plan until Devon Hale had interfered. The footage showed the precise unfolding of events, a chilling grayscale ballet of technology and tactics. The comms chatter provided a cold, dispassionate account. Tideglass actual, you are cleared hot. Execute, execute. Then Devon's voice, calm and steady, despite the circumstances. Negative command, cannot comply, request immediate stand down. The tension in the room thickened. The prosecutor's voice took on a sharper edge. That is a direct order, Tideglass. Execute now. Devon's response was a measured whisper of defiance. Sir, with respect, I cannot. The audio clip was a carefully selected piece of a larger puzzle presented without context, without the human element. It was a surgical strike against her command. As the damning evidence played out, Devon remained outwardly impassive. Her hands were clasped in front of her on the table, her posture perfect. But her right thumb, with a private and unnoticed rhythm, traced a faint, jagged scar that ran across her left palm. It was an instinctual gesture, a subconscious echo of a pain that was both physical and psychological. The scar was a ghost, a physical reminder of a past that was not on her official record, a wound that had never truly healed. It was a ritual of quiet remembrance, of a life and a mission that had been erased from official history. Across the courtroom, her defense attorney, Major Tessa Gran, fought valiantly against the rising tide of evidence. Gran was a sharp-witted officer with a no-nonsense demeanor. Her uniform was pressed to perfection, her dark hair pulled back in a severe bun that seemed to symbolize her tenacity. The defense maintains that Commander Hale acted within her authority as team leader when faced with actionable intelligence regarding civilian presence, Gran argued, her voice a steady counterpoint to the prosecutor's accusations. The rules of engagement clearly state, the rules of engagement do not supersede a direct order from command during an active Operation Major. Judge Drake interrupted, his voice carrying the finality of someone who was unaccustomed to being challenged. The interruption was a clear signal. This was not a trial about the nuances of military protocol. It was a public spectacle, a predetermined outcome. Gran, however, was undeterred. She pressed on, her voice rising in urgency. Your Honor, if I may. We request access to Commander Hale's complete service record, including her deployments with previous units. Her decision-making process can only be fully understood within the context of her extensive operational experience. A ripple of discomfort moved through the courtroom. Devon's service record was a testament to her career, but it was also a tightly controlled narrative. Major Gran was trying to open a door that had been sealed for years. Drake's eyes narrowed slightly, a flash of something akin to annoyance crossing his face. Request denied, he said, his voice flat and final. Commander Hale's previous deployments are not relevant to her refusal to obey orders on April 18th. The court will focus solely on the matter at hand. The ruling was a death blow to the defense's strategy, a clear indication that the judge had no intention of allowing a full and transparent accounting of Devon's service. As the day's proceedings continued, Devon's gaze drifted, scanning the room with the practiced vigilance of a veteran operator. She took in the faces of the officers in the gallery, the rigid formality of their expressions. She observed the two men in dark suits sitting next to Admiral Owen Stratton in the front row, their faces grim and impassive. She noticed Vivian Kershaw in the back, still taking notes, her head bowed in concentration. But then her eyes fell upon Judge Drake's bench, where a manila folder, partially obscured by other case files, sat with a quiet yet profound significance. On the corner of the folder she saw it, a faded insignia, a symbol she hadn't seen in years, one that should not have been there. It was the emblem of Iron Echo, the ghost unit she had commanded, the unit that officially had never existed. The symbol was a simple yet potent reminder of a past that had been buried, a past that had been purposefully erased. A subtle, almost imperceptible flicker crossed Devon's features, a ghost of recognition, a spark of defiance. The judge's condemnation, the prosecutor's accusations, the coldness of the courtroom, it all faded into the background. For a brief, charged moment, all that mattered was the emblem and the unspoken questions it raised. This was not a mistake, it was a deliberate act. The emblem was a signal, a taunt, a reminder that the past she thought she had escaped was not only present, but had come back to haunt her in the most dangerous way imaginable. Drake had to know what that emblem meant. He had to know the significance of the ghost unit. He was not just a judge presiding over a case of insubordination. He was an accomplice, a puppeteer pulling the strings of a much larger, more dangerous game. The silence in the courtroom was not a void, it was a vacuum of unspoken truths, of classified secrets, and of a conspiracy that had followed her from the shadows into the light. Devon's thumb ceased its gentle tracing of the scar. Her eyes, which had been unreadable, now held a new steely resolve. She was no longer just the defendant, a passive participant in her own public humiliation. She was an operator, and she had just identified her target. The judge, the prosecutor, the entire court-martial, they were not just her accusers, they were the enemy. The game had changed, and in that moment, in the sterile silence of the courtroom, Devon Hale knew that she would not leave quietly. She would not allow her story to be buried again. The ghosts of the past were not just haunting her, they were now in the same room, and she was ready to make them visible to everyone. The air in the courtroom, already thick with unspoken judgment, now thrummed with a new, almost electrical tension. Major Tessa Grant, Devon Hale's defense counsel, was a study in controlled frustration. She was battling against an invisible wall, a system designed to be impenetrable. Every argument she presented, every line of questioning, was met with Judge-Advocate Ethan Drake's unyielding dismissiveness. The courtroom was no longer a place for reasoned debate. It was an echo chamber for the prosecution's narrative. Commander Hale's decision was a tactical assessment, not an act of cowardice, Major Grant insisted, her voice tight with suppressed anger. The intelligence packet clearly included a warning of potential civilian presence. She was adhering to the very rules of engagement this court is sworn to uphold. From the bench, Drake merely offered a condescending smirk. Major, your repeated attempts to shift the focus from a clear-cut case of insubordination to a philosophical debate on ethics are noted. However, they are also denied. The facts remain. A direct order was issued. It was disobeyed. We will not be distracted by theoretical possibilities. The gallery, once filled with officers who at least feigned neutrality, now held a new, more ominous audience. Unfamiliar faces, higher-ranking officers who had not been present during the initial days of the court-martial, now filled the front rows. Their presence was a silent statement, a gathering of political power and institutional might. They were not there to listen, they were there to witness the crushing of a maverick, a message being sent to anyone who dared to question the chain of command. The atmosphere had shifted from one of disciplinary hearing to a public execution of reputation. In the back row, Lieutenant Vivian Kershaw continued her discreet note-taking, her head bowed in concentration. But her movements, so carefully measured before, now held a subtle undercurrent of urgency. Her gaze darted from the judge to Devon, then back to her notebook, as if she were desperately trying to connect dots that were not yet visible to the rest of the room. She too sensed the changing currents, the tightening of the noose. The game was escalating. and she was an unwilling player. Suddenly, a disturbance rippled through the back of the courtroom. Two men in plain clothes, their posture and movements betraying a practiced lethal efficiency, moved with purpose. They approached Vivian Kershaw's seat. Their actions were swift, silent, and entirely without ceremony. One of them leaned down and spoke to her. Not a question, but a command. Without a word, Vivian closed her notebook, slipped it into her bag, and rose. She was not resisting. Her face, however, held a flicker of something new, not fear, but a dawning realization, a sudden understanding of a truth that had just revealed itself. The two men escorted her out of a side door, and just as suddenly as she had appeared, she was gone. The entire exchange lasted no more than 30 seconds. Most in the room, engrossed in the legal theatrics, did not even notice her departure. But from the defendant's table, Devon Hale saw everything. Her gaze, which had been fixed on Drake, narrowed perceptibly. Her heart, which had been beating with a slow, steady rhythm, quickened. She recognized the signs. This was not a routine matter. This was a scramble. Someone, somewhere, was trying to contain the damage, to silence a potential witness, to pull a thread that could unravel the entire tapestry of this carefully constructed lie. Vivian Kershaw's sudden disappearance felt like a tightening of the net, a preemptive strike against an unknown threat. But for Devon, it was also a confirmation. She was on the right track. The emblem on the manila folder was not a coincidence, it was the key. When the court reconvened after a brief recess, Drake returned to the bench with a palpable air of smugness. The interruption, the unspoken crisis in the back of the room had clearly emboldened him. He believed he had all the cards. The defense's requests had been denied. The prosecution's case was airtight. The gallery was filled with his allies. He saw Devon Hale as a helpless pawn, cornered, with no move left to make. "Commander Hale," Drake began, his voice dripping with mock sympathy as he leaned forward from the bench, "your defense has proven ineffective. We have heard the evidence, we have seen your actions, and we have listened to the psychological evaluation that suggests you suffer from, and I quote, decision paralysis when faced with high-stakes operational choices." He paused, a cruel smile playing on his lips. "I must ask you again, is it not true that your cowardice, your weakness, caused you to freeze when men's lives were on the line?" Devon Hale's expression remained unreadable, but deep within her, a quiet fire, long suppressed, began to burn. This was not about her. This was not about Operation Tideglass. This was about a secret that had been buried for years, a secret that Drake believed was his alone to keep. She would not allow him to get away with this. Not again. With a calculated calm, she rose from her chair, her posture perfect, every line of her uniform speaking of discipline and a long-forgotten dignity. Her voice, when she spoke, was a startling contradiction to the smug condescension that had filled the room. It was not the desperate tremor of a woman on the verge of defeat, but a clear, steady cadence, a calm that was more unnerving than any outburst. "Your Honor," she said, her words cutting through the tense silence, "I request permission to address the court." The question was a single defiant act of breaking a ritual that demanded her silence. Drake, surprised by this sudden interruption to his self-assured narrative, raised an eyebrow. He did not see it as a strategic gambit. To him, this was the final desperate gasp of a cornered animal, a plea for mercy, a sign of her breaking under the pressure he had so meticulously applied. He saw a final opportunity to exert his power, a triumphant conclusion to his grand performance. "Make it quick, Commander," he said, the wave of his hand a dismissive and impatient gesture. "This court is nearing its conclusion." With that permission, Devon Hale moved to the microphone, her steps measured and deliberate. For a moment, she stood in perfect stillness. a statue of quiet defiance in the center of a room that had been designed to diminish her. And in that moment, something subtle, almost imperceptible, shifted in her bearing. The quiet stoicism of a defendant, a posture of endurance and resignation, gave way to a far more dangerous and profound stance. Her shoulders straightened, her gaze sharpened, and the blank canvas of her expression was replaced by the cold, predatory focus of an operative. She was no longer a woman on trial, subject to the whims and rules of this courtroom. She was a hunter, and the judge, with his condescending smirk and his self-important gavel, was her prey. The power dynamic, for so long tilted in his favor, had just been inverted in a single silent act. She leaned toward the microphone, her movement deliberate and slow, and she spoke just above a whisper. The words were barely audible, a secret shared with the entire room, yet they carried with them the seismic force of a detonation. It was not a shout of protest or a plea for justice, but a key unlocking a truth that was never meant to see the light of day. Iron Echo. The reaction was immediate and electric, but the name, spoken so quietly, tore through the courtroom's suffocating silence like a lightning strike. A colonel in the third row, a man whose posture had been rigidly composed for days, abruptly dropped his pen. The metallic clatter against the polished wood echoed with a disproportionate finality, a sound of order being broken. An admiral in the front row, whose weathered face had been a mask of neutrality, visibly paled, his eyes wide with a shock that was impossible to feign. In the back, a phone began to ring, and a whispered, frantic conversation began as the room's carefully constructed facade of control began to crumble. The call sign, once a whisper in the shadows, was now a thunderclap in the heart of the system. A colonel in the third row, a man who had sat with rigid composure for 3 days, abruptly dropped his pen. The metallic clatter cut through the sudden, suffocating silence of the room. In the front row, Admiral Owen Stratton, a man whose weathered face was a mask of unshakable neutrality, visibly paled. His composure cracked, his eyes wide with a shock that was impossible to feign. In the back, where Vivian Kershaw had sat, someone began whispering frantically into a secure phone, their voice a clipped, coded babble of urgency. The entire room, a carefully controlled tableau of military hierarchy, had just been shattered. Judge Drake, oblivious to the deeper currents, frowned deeply, his smugness giving way to confusion. "What did you say, Commander?" he stammered, his voice lacking its usual authority. "That is not a valid designation." Devon Hale looked directly at him, her gaze unwavering, her voice now stronger, fuller, imbued with a cold, righteous power. "I said, Iron Echo." She paused, letting the name hang in the air, allowing its weight to settle on the consciences of those who knew its meaning. Then she delivered the final, undeniable blow. Operation Harbor Mark, November 2019 to February 2022. The courtroom erupted. Hushed, urgent conversations broke out everywhere. Officers were on their phones, speaking in clipped phrases, their faces a mixture of panic and disbelief. Drake banged his gavel repeatedly, a furious, impotent sound against the rising chaos. "Order! This court will have order!" he insisted, his voice rising in volume but not in authority. "Whatever game you're playing, Commander, it is not relevant to these proceedings." But it was. It was the only thing that was relevant. He was interrupted by one of the men in a dark suit who had accompanied Admiral Stratton. The man, a figure of silent, watchful authority, approached the bench with purposeful strides. He leaned close to Drake and spoke quietly, too low for anyone in the gallery to hear. Then he handed the judge a secure phone. Drake's face, a second ago a mask of furious indignation, transformed in real time. Confusion gave way to shock, then to a creeping, undeniable fear. He listened to the voice on the other end, his eyes wide, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of the bench. The smug confidence, the self-righteous certainty had completely evaporated. He was no longer a judge, he was a terrified subordinate, on the receiving end of an order far greater than any he had ever given. He hung up the phone, his hands trembling slightly. "This court will recess for 1 hour," he announced, his voice unsteady, a ghost of its former self. "All present will remain in the building." As Drake hastily exited through his private chamber's door, the courtroom dissolved into a controlled chaos. Officers formed tight clusters, speaking in hushed, low tones. The two men who had been with Admiral Stratton moved swiftly to secure the exits, politely but firmly turning away curious personnel who had been drawn by the commotion. Phones were confiscated, a clear sign that the information Devon had just released was not merely a secret, but a top-level classification that threatened the very foundations of the military hierarchy. The sudden disappearance of Vivian Kershaw now felt ominous and entirely connected to the unfolding drama. She hadn't been removed as a witness, she had been removed as a liability. The young intelligence officer, who had been an unwitting observer, had become a player in a game that was far deadlier than she could have ever imagined. The moment Devon had uttered the call sign, the recorded testimony in Vivian's bag, and the girl herself had become a potential threat to someone in power. Admiral Owen Stratton, a man whose public composure was legendary, approached Devon's table. He ignored Major Grant, ignored the swirling chaos, and fixed his gaze on Devon. Instead of the anger or indignation one might expect, there was a profound sense of reverence in his eyes. He offered a subtle nod of respect, a silent acknowledgement of a truth that had just been spoken. "Commander Hale," he said quietly, his voice filled with a weary understanding. "It's been a long time. We thought you were dead." His words were a final, definitive confirmation. The game was over. A ghost had walked back into the land of the living, and her presence was about to bring the entire system to its knees. The 1-hour recess was a command, not a suggestion, and the aftermath of Devon Hale's 2 whispered words was immediate. She was not escorted from the courtroom in handcuffs, nor was she treated as a defendant being led back to a holding cell. Instead, 2 senior officers, their faces grim and their posture rigid with a newfound deference, led her through a side door and into a small, nondescript waiting room. It was an anteroom, a place of containment, but not of imprisonment. The distinction was subtle but critical. A single window offered a view of the manicured grounds of Fort Brighton Naval Base, a landscape of order that stood in stark contrast to the chaos she had just unleashed. She was under guard, but the guards were there to protect her as much as they were to secure her. The air in the room was thick with the silent implications of her statement. As she took a seat at a small round table, her defense attorney, Major Tessa Grant, was ushered in. Grant's composure, which had been her defining characteristic, was now in tatters. She moved with a jerky, agitated energy, her eyes wide with a mix of bewilderment and shock. She was a lawyer, trained in the rules of engagement, but Devon had just broken every one of them in a single, devastating move. "What just happened?" Grant demanded, her voice a low, urgent whisper as she closed the door behind her. "You said iron echo like it was a death sentence. The entire room just froze. The judge, the Admiral, everyone. What is it?" Devon looked at her, her expression finally softening, the steely resolve giving way to a weary trust. Grant, after all, was the only one in this room fighting for her. She deserved the truth. She deserved to know the ghosts Devon had been trying to bury. "It was," Devon replied, her voice a low, steady cadence that seemed to fill the quiet room. "A death sentence." She began to speak, her narrative unfolding piece by piece, a story that had been locked away for years, hidden behind layers of classified designations and official lies. She spoke of a unit that didn't exist on paper, a ghost unit that operated off the books, Iron Echo. Their designation was not a call sign in the conventional sense, but a whisper, a confirmation of a secret that was never to be spoken aloud. They were a force of last resort, a small, highly specialized team that handled operations that couldn't happen in places where American forces couldn't officially go. There was no oversight, no acknowledgement, and no chain of command in the traditional sense. They reported to a small classified committee, a handful of men who knew the truth and whose existence was also a secret. Major Grant listened, her shock slowly giving way to a horrified understanding. She was a professional, trained to handle highly sensitive information, but this was beyond anything she had ever encountered. The existence of an entire unit operating outside of the military's legal framework was not just a violation of protocol, it was a fundamental challenge to the entire system of military justice she had sworn to uphold. And Operation Harbormark? Grant asked, her voice barely a whisper, her eyes fixed on Devon's face, searching for a sign that this was all a fabrication. Devon's expression hardened, and her hand, as if on its own accord, went to the jagged scar on her left palm. "Our last mission," she said, the words heavy with the weight of memory. "A covert extraction, just like Tide Glass, but the intelligence, it was falsified. We were sent into a kill box, an ambush." She paused, the silence in the room filled with the echoes of a distant battle. "My entire team, all 7 of them, they were killed. I was the only survivor. I was barely alive." The brutal honesty of her words was more devastating than any legal argument. This was not a story of professional misconduct. It was a eulogy for 7 fallen soldiers, 7 lives erased from the official record, 7 sacrifices that had never been acknowledged. The scar on her palm was not just a wound, it was a tombstone. "I was medically retired," she continued, her voice flat, emotionless, "and on paper, Iron Echo was decommissioned, a convenient way of saying it never existed in the first place." She looked at Grant, her gaze holding a profound sense of loss and betrayal. The mission was a failure, but the failure wasn't ours. The intelligence was deliberately compromised. Someone, somewhere, sent us in to die. Grant was speechless. The meticulously organized world of military law she inhabited had just been shattered by the stark reality of this ghost unit. The trial, the charges of insubordination, the judge's contemptuous tone, it all took on a new, horrifying meaning. It wasn't a disciplinary hearing, it was a cover-up. It was a second act of betrayal against a woman who had already lost everything. "And Drake?" Grant asked, her voice trembling slightly. "What is his connection to all this?" Devon's eyes, which had been filled with the ghosts of her past, now held a cold, unwavering focus. "He was a captain then," she explained, the bitterness of the memory evident in her voice. "He was part of the oversight committee that approved our operations. He signed off on the mission parameters for Harbormark, knowing the intelligence was questionable. He overruled my objections. The truth landed with the force of a physical blow. The judge who had been presiding over her court-martial, the man who had publicly called her weak and cowardly, was the very same man who had 3 years prior sent her and her team into a catastrophic ambush. This wasn't a coincidence. This was an act of personal vindication of a man trying to bury his own sins by destroying the last living witness. The door to the ante-room swung open, and the tense conversation between Devon and Grant was instantly cut short. Both women fell silent, their eyes fixed on the entrance. Standing there was Admiral Owen Stratton, the senior officer Devon had seen in the front row of the courtroom. Although he was in his dress uniform, his demeanor was that of a man who had just encountered a ghost from the past. His weathered face held an expression of profound pain and immense respect. He moved past Grant as if she were not there, walking directly toward Devon. "I thought I might find you here, Commander," he said, his voice low and raspy with emotion. He addressed her not by her current rank but by a familiar title, accompanied by a subtle nod of his head. It was a gesture of reverence that was entirely out of place given the vast difference in their ranks, a small act that carried the weight of a shared history. Devon met his gaze, a quiet understanding passing between them. "I'm not on your record, sir," she said softly, the words a gentle reminder of a buried truth. Stratton's eyes, filled with a weary sadness, grew deeper. "Some things are never put on record," he replied. "A few of us knew the truth, even without any official documentation. After Harbormark, we thought you were lost. That all of you were lost." The heavy silence that followed enveloped the room, pressing down on the two of them like a shared sorrow. Stratton was more than a high-ranking officer. He was a silent mourner, a man who had had to bury a legend and was now confronted with the return of that very legend. "He never should have been involved," Stratton said, his voice hardening as he looked back at the door that led to the courtroom. "Neither should he," Devon replied quietly, her gaze following his. She was not referring to Drake's presence as a judge, but to his very existence in a position of power. He was a cancer in the system, a traitor who had used his position to betray the very men and women he was meant to protect. Stratton understood. He had come to Devon not as an admiral to a subordinate, but as a fellow soldier to a survivor. He had come to offer not just his respect, but an unspoken promise that the truth would finally be revealed. He had been a silent witness to the destruction of Iron Echo, and now he was a silent accomplice in its resurrection. As Stratton turned to leave, he paused at the door, his hand on the doorknob. "The world has changed, Commander," he said, his voice a quiet whisper. "But some things never change. You have a choice now, to stay buried or to come back to life." He exited, leaving Devon and Gran alone again, the room now filled with a new kind of silence. Major Gran, who had been a professional lawyer moments ago, was now an ally, a confidant. She looked at Devon with a newfound respect and a fierce determination. The court-martial, the charges, the judge, it all now seemed like a grotesque joke. This was not a trial, it was a war, and Devon Hale was just beginning to fight. The ghosts of the past were no longer just whispers, they were now her army. And the first battle, the battle for her own story, had just been won. The courtroom, the judge, the entire institution of military justice, it all had to fall to make way for a truth that had been buried for far too long. The dawn that broke over Fort Brighton Naval Base was one of piercing clarity, a stark contrast to the shadowy machinations of the previous day. By 0800 hours, the corridor outside Courtroom 3 was filled with a new kind of crowd. Senior officers, intelligence officials, and civilian observers whose quiet authority far outweighed the rank of those who had previously filled the gallery. There were no hushed whispers, no speculative glances. Conversations fell silent as Devon Hale and Major Tessa Gran approached. The tension in the air was no longer a personal affair, it was an institutional one. When Devon and Major Gran entered the courtroom at precisely 0855, the transformation was immediate and profound. The air, once sterile, now crackled with an almost tangible sense of anticipation. Judge Advocate Ethan Drake was no longer on the bench. In his place sat a new figure, a presence so commanding it seemed to bend the light itself. It was Admiral Colette Rourke, a legendary figure in naval intelligence circles, whose reputation alone was enough to send a clear message about the gravity of the situation. Her face, etched with the lines of hard-won wisdom, was a mask of unyielding authority. Her very presence was an act of a higher power descending to reset the board. The prosecution table, too, had been completely reset. Colonel Hargrove was gone. In his place sat a civilian lawyer with an air of quiet menace, flanked by military personnel whose insignia identified them as Judge Advocate Generals JAG Corps, but with direct attachments to naval intelligence. This was no longer a disciplinary hearing, it was a clean-up operation. The gallery, once a mix of judgment and curiosity, had been cleared of all but the highest-ranking observers and those with a direct, need-to-know involvement in the proceedings. The two stern-faced men in dark suits who had accompanied Admiral Stratton now stood sentinel at the doors, their practiced vigilance a clear indication that no one was leaving and no information was getting out. Most notably, however, was the figure standing silently behind the new prosecution table. Lieutenant Vivian Kershaw, the young intelligence officer who had been so abruptly escorted away, was now back. But she was no longer in civilian attire. She was in her immaculate dress blues, her uniform a stark symbol of her true allegiance. She stood with a posture of perfect military precision, her attention fixed on Devon Hale with an intensity that spoke not of casual interest, but of professional assessment. Her very presence and her placement was a silent confirmation. She had not been a victim of the scramble, but an asset in its execution. She was part of the solution, not a complication. At 0900 sharp, Admiral Rourke entered, and the courtroom rose. If she was surprised by the hushed, expectant audience, her expression did not betray it. She surveyed the room, her gaze sweeping over the assembled brass and silent observers before taking her seat. The gavel, a tool of authority in Drakeface's hands, was now a mere ornament on her bench. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was not a hammer, but a finely sharpened blade, authoritative, precise, and requiring no amplification to command attention. "This tribunal is now in session," she announced, her words cutting through the thick silence. In light of newly accessible classified information, this court-martial is hereby dissolved by direct order of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. All records of these proceedings are classified top secret, effective immediately. The words landed with the weight of a decree, a definitive end to the saga that had consumed Devon for weeks. There would be no verdict, no public vindication in the conventional sense. The truth, in its rawest form, was too dangerous for public consumption. Devon's story was now officially a ghost story, a secret that would be buried even deeper than before, but this time on her terms. Admiral Rourke's gaze settled on Devon. "Commander, please approach." Devon moved forward with the same fluid precision she had maintained throughout the trial. She was no longer walking to her own execution, she was walking toward the light. She stopped before the bench, standing at attention, her gaze steady and unwavering. In an unprecedented break with court protocol, Admiral Rourke descended from the bench. She met Devon halfway, a powerful symbolic act that signified a profound shift in their dynamic. This was no longer a relationship between a judge and a defendant, but between two peers, two leaders who understood the weight of command and the price of betrayal. From a leather portfolio, Rourke withdrew a small, familiar object, Devon's service pistol. She held it out, but first, the ceremonial act, a profound restoration of trust and authority. The cold steel of the weapon, which had been taken from her as a sign of her alleged unworthiness, was now being returned as a sign of her restored honor. "Commander Hale," Rourke said, her voice carrying to every corner of the hushed courtroom, "on behalf of the United States Navy, I extend our deepest apologies for this misunderstanding. Your service record has been amended to accurately reflect your actions during Operation Tieglass, which are now recognized as consistent with the highest traditions of naval service. The vindication was complete. Years of quiet suffering, of carrying the burden of a ghost unit and a ghost mission were finally, officially acknowledged." The weight on Devon's shoulders began to lift, a subtle, almost imperceptible relaxation of her posture that was lost on most, but not on Major Tessa Gran. who watched from the defense table with tears in her eyes. This was more than a legal victory. It was a moral one. Rourke then addressed the reduced audience, carefully choosing her words to reveal the truth without explicitly confirming classified details, without uttering the name Iron Echo. She made it clear that Devon's refusal to follow orders was not an act of weakness. Commander Hale's decision was not, as characterized by the original prosecution, an act of weakness or indecision, Rourke explained. Based on her unique operational experience, she recognized signatures matching a previous operation with catastrophic outcomes. She wasn't disobeying. She was preventing a recurrence of circumstances that had previously resulted in American casualties. The statement, carefully crafted and delivered with the weight of her rank, recontextualized everything. The so-called crime of insubordination was, in fact, an act of supreme courage, a decision born from a hard-won wisdom that only she possessed. It was a moment of profound restoration. A junior officer approached with a file which Rourke reviewed briefly before continuing. Additionally, this court has received documentation indicating that former Judge Advocate Drake had undisclosed conflicts of interest in this case, having been involved in the authorization chain for previous operations relevant to Commander Hale's decision-making process. The revelation was a final damning blow to Drake's career. The truth had finally caught up with him, and it was the same truth he had spent years trying to bury. Devon remained at attention, her expression neutral, but deep within her, a silent sense of justice was finally served. The man who had sent her team to their deaths would now face a reckoning far greater than any public court-martial. As Admiral Rourke concluded the proceedings, she addressed Devon once more. "You are released from these proceedings, Commander. Report to my office at 0800 tomorrow for reassignment." The courtroom began to clear, the remaining observers and officials moving with a sense of quiet purpose. Major Grant approached her client, her eyes still filled with a mixture of disbelief and awe. "Reassignment?" she asked, her voice a low whisper. "After all this?" Devon Hale, her sidearm now holstered, gathered her papers slowly. "Some ghosts don't stay buried, Major," she replied, her voice soft but firm. "Sometimes they come back with a purpose." Through the window she watched as Judge Drake was escorted to a waiting vehicle by two naval security officers, his career effectively over, his legacy destroyed by the truth he had tried to suppress. The reckoning had begun, and Devon Hale, the ghost who refused to stay buried, was ready to take her place in the fight. The weight of silence had been replaced by the power of truth, and a new chapter was about to begin. Admiral Colette Rourke's office occupied the top floor of Naval Intelligence Headquarters, a place of quiet power and formidable perspective. Its windows, stretching from floor to ceiling, offered a commanding panoramic view of Fort Brighton Naval Base, the bustling piers, the grey warships at their berths, the orderly rows of administrative buildings, all moving in a ceaseless, purposeful rhythm. The harbour beyond was a deep, restless blue, dotted with the slow, deliberate movements of tugboats and patrol craft. The office itself was a reflection of the Admiral, Spartan, functional, yet infused with an unmistakable aura of authority. Polished wood paneling, a large uncluttered desk, and a few carefully chosen, antique maps on the walls spoke of a mind that valued precision, history, and strategic thinking. At precisely 0800 hours, Devon Hale stood before that desk. She was once again in her immaculate dress blues, the medals and ribbons across her chest now feeling not like weights, but like a testament to a truth that had finally been acknowledged. The morning light streamed in, catching the polished surfaces of her decorations and casting small, ephemeral rainbows across the rich wood. She was no longer just a ghost, she was a presence, and every line of her posture, every detail of her uniform, spoke of a professionalism that had survived the crucible of a decade of silence. "At ease, Commander," Rourke said, looking up from a file spread before her. Unlike the formal proceedings of the previous day, today her tone carried a note of genuine, unvarnished respect. Her eyes, though sharp and intelligent, were now devoid of judgment. She gestured to the chair opposite her desk. "Please sit." Devon took the offered chair, her posture remaining militarily precise despite the relaxed command. Between them on the desk lay a thick leather portfolio, stamped with a classification so high that most naval officers would never know it existed. This was not a summary, this was the truth, the real one. "I've spent the night reviewing your complete service record," Rourke began, her fingertips tapping gently on the portfolio's cover. "The real one, 15 years of exemplary service, the last 3 of which officially never happened." Devon met her gaze evenly. "That was my understanding, Admiral. Until yesterday," Rourke said, her voice dropping slightly, her eyes holding Devon's. "Your decision to invoke Iron Echo has created quite a ripple effect. The Secretary of the Navy personally contacted me at midnight. This is a very sensitive matter, Commander." Devon remained silent, a silent, watchful observer in a game that was far bigger than herself. She had played her hand, and now she was waiting to see the counter-move. "Let's be clear about what happened 3 years ago," Rourke continued, leaning back in her chair. "Operation Harbormark. Your team, the unit known as Iron Echo, was inserted into territory where we had no official presence, based on intelligence that suggested an imminent attack on U.S. interests. That intelligence, it was incomplete at best, deliberately misleading at worst." Devon's expression hardened, a brief, fleeting glimpse of the pain she had carried for so long. "My team was ambushed within 20 minutes of insertion," she stated flatly, the clinical detachment in her voice a shield against the raw grief of the memory. "The intelligence was compromised. I recommended abort 3 times during the planning phase. I was overruled by the Oversight Committee, which included then Captain Draker." Rourke finished for her, the name a stone dropping into a still pond. "He overruled you, along with several others. All 7 of your team members were killed. You sustained critical injuries, but, against all odds, managed to complete exfiltration alone. I didn't complete the mission parameters," Devon noted, the old familiar guilt resurfacing. "The target escaped." Rourke's voice, which had been solemn, now took on a sharp edge. "The mission was compromised from the start. You are the only reason we didn't lose 8 operators that night instead of 7. That distinction matters, Commander." A heavy silence filled the office, broken only by the distant, muffled sound of the base's daily life. Through the window, a helicopter lifted off from a landing pad, its rotor blades a blur against the clear morning sky, unaware of the classified history being reconciled in this room. "Fast forward to Operation Tideglass last month," Rourke continued, leaning forward on her desk. "You recognize similarities in the intelligence pattern. The same signatures that preceded Harbormark. The same hurried timeline, the same pressure to proceed despite red flags. Rather than sending your new team into another potential ambush, you refused the order, and you were court-martialed for it." Devon Hale's voice, devoid of any raw emotion but heavy with the weight of years of silent suspicion, delivered a final, chilling conclusion. "By the same legal officer who had helped authorize the original compromised mission," she stated, the profound irony of it, a bitter taste she had been savoring for far too long. It was the ultimate betrayal, a cycle of deception that had come full circle. The man who had once signed the papers that sent her team to their deaths was now the one attempting to bury her and their story in the cold, unyielding ground of military justice. Admiral Rourke confirmed it with a single, sharp word. "Exactly." She leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping to a confidential tone that cut through the silence of the office. Drake had not been an impartial arbiter of justice, he had been a conspirator in an ongoing cover-up. Drake had every reason to want your concerns discredited and your career destroyed, Rourke explained, her words a hammer blow of truth. It would have protected him from any accountability for what happened during Harbormark. His court-martial was a calculated, desperate act of self-preservation, a preemptive strike to silence the last living witness to his grievous error. What he couldn't have predicted, however, was the very weapon he had tried to bury turning on him. What he didn't count on, however, was you using Iron Echo as a defense. That call sign was supposed to be buried forever. Most who knew of its existence believed all members were deceased, which was convenient for certain parties. The call sign, once a whisper in the dark, had become a thunderclap, a ghost from the past returning to haunt the very people who had tried to erase it. It was the ultimate act of defiance, a resurrection of a truth that many had hoped would stay entombed. Rourke stood, her posture shifting from a conversational one to that of a seasoned strategist. She moved to the window, her back to Devon, her figure a symbol of a tactical mind contemplating a vast and complicated chessboard. The sprawling naval base below, a universe of order and duty, was a stark reminder of the immense institutional forces at play. After a long moment of contemplation, she returned to her desk, the silence of the room punctuated by the crisp professional rustle of papers. She opened a drawer and withdrew a sealed envelope, its existence a testament to the immense power that had been brought to bear on Devon's fate. "Commander, I've been authorized to offer you several options regarding your future with the Navy," she said, her voice now a calm, professional directive. "These options come directly from the Secretary of the Navy, with the full support of the Joint Chiefs. The gravitas of the situation was now unassailable." Rourke presented the first envelope, the first offering on a path of 3. First option: honorable discharge with full pension and benefits, effective immediately. Your service record would be amended to reflect appropriate commendations, though the specifics of your operations would remain classified. It was a carefully packaged peace offering, a chance to walk away from the ghosts and the shadows, to accept a life of quiet anonymity in exchange for her silence. Devon received the envelope without opening it, her hands steady, her expression unreadable. This was not a choice, it was a test. She was waiting for the real options. "Second option," Rourke continued, producing another folder, "reassignment to Naval Special Warfare Development Group as a tactics and strategy instructor. Your experience would be invaluable to the next generation of operators without requiring you to return to field operations." Devon took the second folder, her eyes still fixed on the Admiral, a silent question hanging in the air. "And the third option?" Devon asked, her voice a low, steady whisper. Rourke hesitated, then pulled a final folder from her desk. Unlike the others, this one bore no markings, not even a classification level. It was a blank slate, a future yet to be written. Reinstatement to active operational status under direct Pentagon authority. Commander of a new unit. One with full awareness of past mistakes and built-in safeguards to prevent their recurrence. This would be a high-stakes, off-the-books role, but with an unprecedented level of support. Devon's expression remained neutral, but her eyes, for the first time since she had entered the office, were fixed on the unmarked folder, a flicker of something long dormant stirring within them. "Who would have oversight?" she asked, the question cutting to the very heart of the matter. "I would," Rourke replied simply, "directly. No committees, no layers of deniability, no intermediaries. Just a clear chain of accountability, straight to the top. I would be your direct line." Devon considered the 3 options before her. Honorable discharge, a life of peace, a quiet existence. Instructor, a life of purpose, a way to pass on her hard-won wisdom. Or reinstatement, a life of war, a chance to finally confront the ghosts that had haunted her for so long. She had been on trial for insubordination, for disobeying an order that would have killed her team. Now, she was being offered a chance to lead a new team, to make a new kind of order, and to finally achieve a justice that could never be found in a courtroom.
"May I have time to consider?"
Devon asked, her voice calm. "Of course," Rourke said, glancing at her watch. "I have a meeting at the Pentagon this afternoon. I'll need your decision by 0900 tomorrow." As Devon rose to leave, Rourke added, "One more thing, Commander. Judge Drake has submitted his resignation, effective immediately. The investigation into his conduct regarding Habermark and subsequent events is ongoing." "Will it be made public?" Devon asked. "No," Rourke replied, "but those who need to know will be informed of the findings. His career is over one way or another." Devon nodded once, then departed with the 3 options tucked under her arm, her decision already forming in her mind. But as she stepped into the corridor, a final chilling realization from her conversation with Rourke echoed in her thoughts, a truth that transformed her potential new mission from an act of justice into a personal crusade. Rourke hadn't just said the intelligence for Habermark was faulty. She had said it was deliberately sabotaged. The revelation hit Devon with the force of a physical blow, confirming a suspicion she had carried, a silent, festering wound in her soul for 3 years. It wasn't a mistake, it was an act of betrayal. Someone, a ghost of a different kind, had been embedded in the command structure, feeding them false information, leading them into an ambush. And the man responsible, the mole, the true enemy, might still be there. Devon's court-martial, the public humiliation, the near destruction of her career, it was all a symptom of a much larger, more pervasive corruption. Rourke's final words echoed in her mind, not as a suggestion, but as a command. "You're not just reinstated," she had said, her voice dropping to a low, serious tone. "You're hunting a ghost." The mission was now clear. The new unit, the direct oversight, the blank slate, it was all for this. It was for the ghosts of Iron Echo. It was for the men she had lost, and the truth that had been buried with them. Devon Hale, the survivor, the ghost, was about to become the hunter. The game was no longer about her honor. It was about the lives of her team and the reckoning for the man who had betrayed them. The cemetery at Arlington carried a solemn beauty in the late afternoon light. The sun, a low golden orb, cast long, deep shadows across the meticulously maintained grounds, illuminating the endless, precise rows of white marble headstones. The silence here was not a vacuum, but a presence, a living, breathing tribute to sacrifice and memory. Devon Hale moved between the markers with a practiced, almost reverent familiarity. She was no longer in her dress blues, but in simple, unassuming civilian clothes, a deliberate choice to shed the mantle of command and embrace the private grief she had carried for so long. Her posture, however, still marked her as military, the perfect alignment of her shoulders, the purposeful rhythm of her gait. She navigated to a specific section, a newer plot where the markers bore more recent dates, a silent testament to the ongoing cost of freedom. She stopped before a row of 7 headstones, each one a stark white monument to a life cut short. To anyone reviewing the official cemetery records, these men had died in separate training accidents or routine deployments across different years and theaters of operation. Nothing connected them in the official narrative, but Devon knew better. These were her men, her team, the ghosts of Iron Echo, Petty Officer Marcus Donovan, Chief Elijah Talbot, Lieutenant Nadir Corey. All 7 names, etched in stone, were a silent, permanent reminder of a truth that had been buried. They were her crew, the men who had been sent into an ambush, and she, the only one who had come out. From the pocket of her jacket she withdrew 7 small, smooth stones she had collected from a quiet beach that morning. They were polished by the tides, worn smooth by the ceaseless rhythm of the ocean, a symbol of endurance and eternal return. One by one, with a ritualistic slowness, she placed a stone atop each headstone. It was a private ceremony, a sacred act of remembrance that had been a team ritual on deployments when they passed the graves of fallen comrades from other units. The stones were a promise, a vow, I remember. I carry you with me. Your sacrifice will not be in vain. Each stone was a word in a silent prayer, a final communication to the men she had lost. The weight of the stones in her hand was nothing compared to the weight on her soul. "Thought I might find you here," came a voice from behind her. Admiral Colette Rourke approached, also in civilian attire, her presence here a profound, unspoken breach of protocol. She stood beside Devon, her own face etched with a weary respect as she surveyed the row of headstones. This wasn't a commanding officer to a subordinate, it was a fellow soldier to a fellow soldier, a woman of power to a woman of profound loss. Petty Officer Marcus Donovan, Chief Elijah Talbot, Lieutenant Nadir Corey, Rourke murmured, reading the names from the stones, the names that the official record had so conveniently disconnected, all listed as separate incidents, but they died together. "On my watch," Devon said quietly, the familiar guilt a bitter taste in her mouth. "Under your command," Rourke corrected, her voice firm, "but not due to your decisions. That distinction matters, Commander. They died because they were betrayed." They stood in silence for a moment, the only sound the soft rustling of leaves in the gentle breeze that stirred the trees. It was a moment of shared grief, a quiet acknowledgement of the cost of their profession. A burden had been shared, and Devon felt the years of silent anguish begin to recede, replaced by a quiet sense of purpose. "Have you decided?" Rourke finally asked, nodding toward the folders Devon held. "I have," Devon replied. She turned to face the Admiral directly, her eyes clear and unwavering. "I'll take the third option, but I have conditions." Rourke's expression remained neutral, but a flicker of respect entered her eyes. Devon Hale was not a subordinate. She was a partner, a force of nature that could not be simply commanded. "I'm listening," Rourke replied. Devon began to lay out her terms, not as requests, but as non-negotiable foundations for a new beginning. "I select my own team. No interference in personnel choices. Granted," Rourke said without hesitation, "within security parameters. I maintain direct communication with you at all times," Devon continued. "No intermediaries who might filter or manipulate intelligence. The chain of accountability stops with you." Rourke nodded. "That is precisely why I was selected for oversight. No committees, no deniability. You have my direct line." And finally, Devon said, her voice dropping, infused with the immense emotional weight of her purpose, "I want the families of these men to receive the full benefits they deserve, not the cover story benefits, but everything they would be entitled to if the true nature of their service were known." Rourke considered this request, her eyes briefly scanning the headstones. She was a woman of intelligence and strategy, but she was also a woman of honor. "I can't guarantee medals or public recognition, Commander. The nature of their service must remain classified, but I can ensure their families are properly compensated, full financial security, educational benefits for their children, the full package." "That's acceptable," Devon agreed, her gaze returning to the 7 stones, a silent promise finally fulfilled. "They deserve better than they got." "Yes," Rourke acknowledged solemnly. "That's why we need you back. Not everyone at the top is corrupt, Commander. Some of us remember what honor means." As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, casting long, solemn shadows across the cemetery grounds, Devon made her decision final. She handed the signed reinstatement papers to Rourke. The weight of the 3 folders was gone, replaced by a new, more profound sense of purpose. "What do we call this new unit?" she asked, the first question of her new command. "Since Iron Echo is now compromised." "That's your first assignment," Rourke replied with a slight smile. Choose a name no one will remember until they need to. With a respectful nod toward the fallen, both women turned and began to walk back toward the cemetery gates. When do I start? Devon asked, a newfound energy in her step. You already have, Rourke answered. Your new credentials and facility access will be active by morning. Your first intelligence briefing is scheduled for 0700. Any particular focus I should be aware of? Devon asked, her tactical mind already shifting into gear. Rourke's expression grew serious, her eyes holding the weight of a secret far greater than any courtroom drama. Yes, we have reason to believe the intelligence compromise that led to Harbormark wasn't an isolated incident. Someone deliberately fed false information that sent your team into an ambush. She paused, letting the truth sink in. You're saying there's a domestic component to the operation? Devon asked, the realization a cold, hard stone in her gut. I'm saying your new mission has two objectives, Rourke clarified. External threats, yes, but also identifying whoever was responsible for Harbormark. We clean our own house first. As they parted ways at the cemetery entrance, Devon felt something she hadn't experienced since before the ambush, a certainty of purpose. She had a new team, a new mission, and a new chance to honor the men she had lost. The next morning, Commander Devon Hale entered a nondescript office building in Quantico. Her new credentials, bearing the highest classification, granted her access to a secure elevator that descended deeper than the building's official blueprints suggested. When the doors opened, she found herself in a state-of-the-art operations center, a clandestine hub of technology and silent, watchful purpose. 5 people waited for her, each standing as she entered. "Commander on deck," announced a familiar voice. It belonged to Lieutenant Vivian Kershaw, who was now dressed in tactical gear rather than civilian attire. Her presence was a silent validation of Rourke's trust. Devon had chosen well. "At ease," Devon replied automatically, surveying the room and the personnel. One by one, the others introduced themselves, each bringing specialized skills and each connected in some way to her former team. They had been selected not just for their abilities, but for their personal investment in the mission ahead. The tactical specialist, a former Force Recon Marine, the signals intelligence expert. Each was a ghost from a different branch of service, called back for a shared purpose. "Our unit designation?" asked the Force Recon Marine. Devon thought of the unmarked graves, the 7 stones she had laid, and the silent promise she had made. Ghostline, she decided, the name a whisper of a forgotten truth. Because we stand watch for those who no longer can. As the team briefed her on their first potential operation, Devon felt her fallen teammates present in spirit, guiding this new beginning. The wheels of accountability had begun turning. Drake's career was over, but he was merely the first thread in a larger conspiracy she now had the authority and resources to unravel. Justice would come, not in a courtroom with public vindication, but in the shadows where her team had always operated best. The graves at Arlington stood as silent testament to sacrifices most would never know about. But now, those sacrifices would have meaning through the continued service of those who remembered. The ghost who had returned was about to lead her own line of ghosts, to hunt a truth that had been buried for too long. As the camera pulls back, revealing the silent, purposeful hum of the Ghostline Operations Center, the echoes of a journey come into sharp focus. This is not the sterile, oppressive silence of a courtroom, but the charged, expectant quiet of a command center, where silence is the crucible of strategy. We have witnessed the remarkable journey of Commander Devon Hale, a woman once labeled weak by a judge, a woman who carried the burden of a ghost unit and a ghost mission, finally stepping out of the shadows to command her own destiny. Her medals, once weights of a past she could not speak of, are now symbols of a truth that has been resurrected. The scar on her palm, a private tombstone for a team she thought she had lost forever, is now a mark of her new resolve. She is no longer just a survivor, she is a hunter. The story of Devon Hale is a testament to the fact that justice does not always wear a gavel. Sometimes it wears a uniform and operates in the deep shadows, guided by a moral clarity that transcends the limits of bureaucracy and legal code. Judge Ethan Drake's quiet, inglorious fall is a powerful reminder that those who attempt to bury the truth and the people who hold it will ultimately be consumed by their own lies. His career, built on a foundation of betrayal and self-preservation, was dismantled not in a public spectacle, but in the cold, efficient machinery of the very system he tried to corrupt. His reckoning may not have made the headlines, but for those who need to know, for the families of the fallen and the commanders who remember what honor means, it was complete. And so, a new chapter begins with the creation of Ghostline. The name is not a simple designation, but a vow. It is a promise to the 7 men who lie in Arlington, their sacrifices officially disconnected, but forever bound by a shared memory. Ghostline is the living embodiment of that memory. A team brought together not just by their skills, but by their personal connection to the tragedy of Operation Harbormark. Lieutenant Vivian Kershaw, the young intelligence officer who secretly recorded Devon's trial, is no longer an observer. She is an integral part of this new mission, an echo of the truth that first cracked the foundation of the conspiracy. Every member of this new unit carries a piece of the past, a silent vow to ensure that the ghosts of their comrades will finally find peace. Theirs is a dual mission, a hunt that looks outward at the threats in the world and inward at the rot within. They are tasked with protecting the living, but first they must hold accountable those who betrayed the fallen. The traitor who deliberately sabotaged Operation Harbormark, the mole who sent Devon and her team into a kill zone, is still out there, embedded within the highest levels of command. This is not just a military operation, it is a profound act of personal and institutional accountability. Ghostline exists to clean their own house, to cut out the cancer that festers in the shadows, and to restore a measure of honor to the system that betrayed them. For Devon Hale, this is not a choice of command, it is a necessity of purpose. She has traded the weight of silence for the power of truth, the burden of survival for the solemn duty of a reckoning. She stands at the center of the Ops Center, a commander reborn, a ghost returning with a purpose that is both personal and profound. She will lead her new team not just with tactics and strategy, but with the memory of the 7 men whose names are etched on the stones in Arlington. They are the silent witnesses, the true north of her moral compass. And with every decision, every move, every step into the shadows, she honors them. And so, this is where our story ends for now. A ghost has returned to the land of the living, ready to hunt the shadows that betrayed her. We hope this untold tale of courage and command has left you with a new understanding of the true meaning of honor. On behalf of the entire team here at Veteran Biker, we want to extend a heartfelt thank you for watching and for being a part of our community. We want to hear from you. What do you think will be Ghostline's first move? What questions would you have for Commander Hale? Let us know in the comments below. Your feedback and support help us continue to bring you these powerful stories. If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing to our channel and giving us a thumbs up. Your subscription helps us keep the engine running. And don't go anywhere just yet. We've got more stories waiting for you. You can check out our other videos that are appearing on your screen right now. We'll see you in the next video, where we continue to explore the courage, the honor, and the untold tales that shape our world. Thank you for riding along with Veteran Biker.